I remember the first night I arrived at the cabin. The road had narrowed into nothing but a winding ribbon of cracked asphalt, flanked by dense pine trees whose tops vanished into fog. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of cedar and old smoke, the kind that sticks to your clothes and hair. The lights flickered once, twice, and then a silence settled so thick it felt alive. Outside, the wind rustled the branches, carrying whispers I couldn't quite place. I poured myself a cup of tea, hoping the warmth would settle my nerves, but every sip seemed colder than the last. Then I heard it a low hum, almost like a heartbeat, coming from somewhere deep in the woods. My eyes traced the shadows cast by the pale moonlight on the walls, stretching and bending like they were moving of their own accord. That's when I saw it. The forest welcomed me first. Fog curled the pines, thin and pale. It clung to my skin, damp, cold, almost alive. I stepped onto the cabin's wooden porch. The boards groaned beneath my weight. A low hum drifted through the trees, soft, insistent, threading the silence like breath. I had expected emptiness. Alone, yes, yet the tree moved. Shadows stretched and twisted, and I thought I saw someone or something watching from between the trunks. The smell of damp needles and old wood filled the air. I inhaled slowly. The hum lingered, pressing against my ears, and my fingers itched, curling around the doorframe. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of ash and pine sap. I had locked the door. I had checked it twice, but it creaked open, softly, almost apologetically. A breath of cold air pushed past me. I froze. The fog pressed against the windows. Each pane captured a different shadow. Rustling, soft footsteps, just beyond my sight. The hum throbbed, now mingling with a static in the corners of my mind. I moved closer to the door. The wood felt slick beneath my fingertips, chilled, unwelcoming. I half expected a hand to reach out from the darkness, yet only silence greeted me. Outside, the trees whispered. The fog shifted in slow waves. A movement flickered between two pines, and I thought I saw a pale face, eyes catching the little light there was. Then it vanished. I blinked. Alone. The hum remained, soft and curling, like the breath of the forest itself. I backed into the cabin. The floorboards were colder now, and I could almost feel the fog curling through the cracks in the walls. The door still ajar. I wanted to close it, wanted to slam it, but something held me, rooted me to the floor. Outside, the wind shifted. Needles pattered against the cabin walls. The hum quivered, pulsing in quiet rhythms. The shadows grew longer, thinner, stretching like fingers toward the house. I turned back to the window. The tree was alive, rustling, twisting, breathing. A figure lingered there, pale and still. It waited. A thought whispered through my mind. Am I seeing it, or is it waiting for me to see? The door moved again. A slow, deliberate shift. No wind, no touch, just a soft, inevitable creak, as if it had been unlocked by someone or something else. I stepped back. The hum softened, then receded. I could hear my own breath again, shallow and quick. The fog pressed closer to the windows. The forest exhaled. I did not move. I could not. Outside, the shadows stayed, watching, patient, and the hum lingered just a moment longer, then faded into the stillness of the night. The cabin was silent, alone, and yet not quite. The kitchen smelled faintly of cold metal and old pine. Pale light spilled through the window, brushing the counters in quiet silver. Outside, the fog pressed against the glass, soft and heavy. I leaned over the sink. My reflection stared back. Too long. It didn't move when I moved. A blink, and it smiled. The edges of the glass fogged, curling like smoke. Shapes appeared where none should be. Hints of shadows, twisting, thin, fleeting. A brush of cold air slid along my neck. It wasn't the wind. It carried the scent of wet earth, of needles pressed to damp soil. I shivered. The mirror held me still. Or maybe it held something else. A silence hung behind my ears, soft, pressing, patient. I moved a hand. The reflection stayed. I moved again, slower, more deliberate. Still it lingered. I wanted to step back. The floor was cool beneath my feet, tiles slick from the fog seeping in under the door. I could hear the hum of the forest outside, rustling needles and distant hollow creaks. The reflection's smile widened. It knew. It waited. It breathed when I did not. I blinked again. Shapes in the fog shifted, forming angles that felt wrong. A hand, a shadow of a hand, stretched along the glass, though nothing touched it from my side. I wanted to reach out, to trace the edges of the glass with my fingers, but my hand hovered, trembling, and the cold air curled around my wrists like smoke. The reflection leaned closer. I did not. It followed my motion with subtle slowness, mimicking, mocking. Outside, the fog deepened, folding into itself. The trees whispered in soft static. I could hear my breath again, ragged and small, yet the mirror kept it secret. I stepped away cautiously, and the fog shapes melted back into silver mist. The smile lingered, faint now, like a trace left in the corner of an empty room. I felt the air shift behind me again, a quiet pull along my spine, the hum of the forest threading through the walls. I did not turn. The mirror cleared. Nothing remained, just my own face, pale and uncertain. I stayed there, the cold metal of the sink beneath my hands, the pale light brushing my cheek, the silence stretching like a breath that could not be released. I wanted to leave, and yet something kept me rooted. Outside, fog drifted across the window. Shadows gathered in the corners, still, patient. And the kitchen, empty now, felt not quite alone. The cabin sat quiet, too quiet. A crackling hum floated through the air, thin and uneven, like old radio static. I rose slowly, barefoot on the cool floorboards. The hum tugged at my ears, insistent, soft. I followed it toward the door. Outside, the fog was thick, draping the grass in damp gray. Each step pressed cold dew into my toes, grass brushing my ankles. The hum sharpened. A whisper, my name, stretched across the mist. The trees bent in impossible ways. Branches twisted like fingers reaching toward the ground, their bark wet and rough beneath my fingertips. Shadows pooled beneath their curves, dark and slow. I paused. The static hummed higher, sharper. A faint metallic tang lingered in the air. And then it stopped. Silence folded over the forest, heavier than the fog itself. I could hear the wet scrape of my shoes against the grass, the gentle exhale of the wind through needles and leaves. But no sound answered me back. The fog shifted. Shapes moved inside it, then dissolved. I strained to see, but there was nothing, and yet I knew I wasn't alone. The hum returned faintly, fragmented, curling around my thoughts. Soft footsteps? No, just the rhythm of something breathing in the trees. I walked deeper into the mist. The damp pressed against my skin, wet and insistent. Branches brushed my arms, cold and rough. The static pulsed again, fleeting, fractured, almost playful. It whispered my name again, closer, behind me, but I did not turn. Shadows shifted in the fog. A pale shimmer caught the corner of my eye. I blinked. Nothing, yet the feeling stayed, settled in my chest, slow and deliberate. I stopped in a small clearing. The fog wrapped around me like a cloak, wet and heavy. Clinging, the static faded. The forest held its breath. A faint smell of earth and decay rose from the damp ground. I pressed my palms to my knees, trying to feel the solid earth beneath me. The silence hummed softly, echoing in the hollows of the trees. Something watched. Patient, I dared a slow step forward. Then another. The mist shifted, swirling around my feet. I could sense movement, just beyond reach. Not fast, not loud, but enough. The hum returned one last time, softer now, almost regretful. I shivered. The air pressed against my face, thick and close. The forest exhaled around me. The fog settled, and the world felt impossibly still. I turned back toward the cabin. The static faded into memory. The cold grass clung to my soles. The trees straightened, shadows folding back into themselves. I did not look behind me. I did not need to. The fog hung low, quiet, watching. And though nothing moved, I knew I had not walked alone. Night fell early. The cabin glowed with a dim, unnatural light, pale and tremulous. It pressed against the walls, soft yet insistent, spilling across the wooden floor. I stood by the window. The glass was cool against my fingertips, fogged faintly with my own breath. Outside, the trees swayed in a slow, deliberate rhythm. A shadow moved across the trunks. At first, I thought it was a wind, but then it mimicked me. I raised a hand. The shadow raised its own. I turned my head. Nothing. The air smelled of wet pine and cold earth. A low hum lingered, subtle, pressing at the edges of my ears. I could feel the pulse of the cabin beneath the floorboards, slow and uneven, like a distant heartbeat. I leaned closer to the glass. The shadow moved in perfect reflection of my gestures. Smooth, deliberate, impossible. A shiver ran down my spine. The light shifted, brushing the trees in pale silver. A soft knock echoed, slow, measured, from the other side. I could feel it in the soles of my feet, through the floor, vibrating in rhythm with the hum. I did not move. I did not breathe too loud. The forest waited, still and patient. The shadow lingered, now at the edge of the fog, wavering like smoke caught in the night. I pressed my palms to the glass. The cold seeped into my skin, numbing, insistent. The hum softened, almost curious, curling around my ears. The fog thickened beyond the window, twisting and curling around invisible shapes. I stepped back. The knock came again, lighter now, almost shy. I felt the air shift behind me, warm and cold at the same time, carrying the scent of earth and something faintly metallic. The shadow remained outside, still following, still watching. I could see my own reflection in the glass, pale, uncertain. And yet, in the corner of the pane, another face lingered, just a flicker, just a breath of it. The knock ceased. Silence settled. The cabin exhaled around me, the dim light trembling softly. Outside, the fog wrapped the trees in quiet stillness. I did not turn. I did not move toward the door. I could feel it watching, patient, waiting, and somehow I understood I was not alone. The shadow slipped back into the mist. The hum faded to nothing. The cabin remained, glowing dim and uneven, and I stood there, pressed to the window, breath shallow, skin cold, alone, but not. The cabin had grown quieter. Night pressed against the windows, thick and still. Above me, the attic whispered. Soft, deliberate footsteps traced along the floorboards. Heavy, intentional, each one a slow pulse, pressing against the ceiling. I held my breath. The air smelled faintly of dust and old wood, dry and sharp. I could feel the hum of the cabin beneath my feet, echoing the rhythm of the attic above. The stairs groaned as I climbed, each step a careful, measured movement. My palms brushed the railing, cool and rough, and the scent of damp would fill my nose. I reached the top. The attic was dim, shadows pooling in corners. A pale figure crouched there. I blinked. It vanished. Only the floorboards remained, groaning under some unseen weight. The hum from below seemed distant now, muted, swallowed by the heavy air. The attic smelled colder, mustier, and a faint rustling lingered, curling around my ears. I stepped forward. The floorboards moaned beneath my weight. Shadows twisted along the rafters, thin and slow, as if the darkness itself were breathing. I paused. The figure might have returned, hidden in the edges of the gloom, or perhaps it had never moved at all. A shiver ran down my spine. The air pressed against my cheeks, wet and cold, whispering with the faint scent of old linen and earth. I dared to move again, slow and careful, my hand trailing along the wall. The attic seemed to stretch, elongated, patient, filled with a soft, inevitable groan of invisible steps. The figure never appeared again. Only the whispers of the attic, the shifting shadows, and the floorboards, heavy and uneven under nothing at all. I leaned against the wall, breath shallow, feeling the cold pulse of the house beneath me. The attic exhaled, folding its whispers back into silence. I did not move for a long moment. The night waited. The cabin waited. And I stood there, alone, with only the lingering impression of something watching, patient, unseen, and just beyond reach. The trail behind the cabin was quiet. Night had pressed a fog into the trees, thick and slow. The air smelled damp, earthy, carrying the faint tang of pine and wet soil. I walked slowly, barefoot brushing the soft, cold grass. Each step pressed dew into my soles. The hum of the forest wrapped around me, low, constant, almost a whisper. Then I saw it, a shadow between the trees. It didn't belong. It lingered, stretching thin along the trunks, shrinking, bending as a moon slipped behind clouds. Each movement was subtle, deliberate, but somehow impossible. I paused. The air pressed against my skin, cold and wet, clinging. My breath hung in misted clouds. The shadow moved with me, matching each hesitant step. I turned a corner. It was closer, closer still, not running, not chasing, but patient, deliberate, tracking me through the fog. The trees whispered around me. Leaves rustled softly, brushing one another, and a distant hum curled into the silence. My skin prickled. Every nerve stretched taut, waiting. I quickened my pace. The ground beneath my feet felt uneven, slick with moss and dew. The shadow mirrored me. Still patient, still impossible. I blinked. It shifted with the fog, folding into the mist. The trail stretched ahead. Empty, the trees waited. The air held a quiet tension, thick and cold. I stopped. Silence fell over the forest, heavy and complete. No hum, no footsteps, just a slow exhale of the fog between the pines. I could feel it had been there, close, watching, patiently waiting, just beyond the edge of vision. The shadow vanished entirely. Only the fog remained, curling around roots and low branches. The forest smelled damp, familiar, yet different, thicker, heavier. I retraced my steps slowly. Each rustle, each creak of the wet ground beneath my feet reminded me that I was not quite alone. And yet nothing followed. The trail folded back into the cabin's clearing. The fog pressed against the windows, pale and silent. I could feel the forest breathing around me, and somewhere just beyond, the shadow waited. The windows were fogged. Soft, curling clouds pressed against the glass. It smelled faintly of rain and wet pine. I pressed my palm to the pane. Cold, damp, a breath lingering outside. I wiped the circle clear, fingers trembling, leaving streaks of condensation. And then I saw them. Eyes, not mine, staring through the glass, unmoving, unblinking. They reflected the cabin perfectly. The worn table, the dim pale light, the shadowed corners. I froze. The air seemed thicker, pressing against my face, wet and still. The faint hum of the forest outside was muted. I blinked. The eyes were still, watching, patient. I reached out, fingertips hovering over the glass. The fog clung to my skin, cold and heavy, the smell of damp earth curling into the room. I stepped back. The eyes lingered, reflecting everything around them, but nothing moved. No breath, no sound. Then a soft shift in the air. The fog blurred, and the eyes vanished. Silence stretched in the cabin. The dim light trembled across the walls. The cold glass pressed against my palms. Nothing remained, only the faint tang of wet pine and earth. I breathed slowly, shallow, feeling the damp settle into my skin. The forest waited beyond the windows. Still, patient, I pressed my forehead against the glass. The fog began to curl once more, as if someone or something was just outside, watching, waiting, but unseen. The cabin felt heavy. Night pressed against the walls, thick and unmoving. The smell of damp wood and old pine settled into every corner. A soft hum drifted through the air, melodic, gentle, almost comforting at first. But it followed me. Through the kitchen, I stepped lightly. The hum mirrored my pace, stretching, bending, curling through the room. The cold tiles pressed against my feet, grounding me. Past the fireplace, the hum persisted. Soft, insistent, layered with a faint metallic tang. I paused. It stopped. I moved again. It resumed, curling around me, tracing my steps with impossible accuracy. The floorboards creaked beneath me, damp with condensation. The air smelled of faint smoke and wet earth. I tried to ignore it, but it followed through the hall, sliding along the walls, brushing my skin like a cold breath. I could feel it, patient, waiting, reflecting me perfectly. I turned a corner. The hum stretched into a higher note, delicate, teasing. It mimicked the rise and fall of my own breath. I shivered, feeling the pulse of it in my chest. The shadows in the hallway shifted. Curtains fluttered with slow, unseen wind. The hum hummed in response, curling around corners, never distant, never still. I pressed my hand against the railing, cold and rough. The hum echoed my heartbeat, slow, quick, soft, melodic, and impossibly in tune. I stopped. The house held its breath. The hum faded into nothing, leaving only the cold air and faint smell of pine. Silence pressed against my ears. I took another step. The hum returned, patient, gentle, like it had always been following, waiting for me to notice, to match its rhythm. I leaned against the wall, breath shallow, palms cold. The hum lingered around me, soft, impossible, until the corners of the room seemed to curl in, folding the sound back into the darkness. I did not move. The house settled around me, and somewhere in the quiet, the hum waited. I stepped outside. The fog pressed against my skin, damp and cold. It clung to my hair, curled around my shoulders, heavy and slow. Footsteps echoed behind me, soft, deliberate, impossible to ignore. I held my breath. The air smelled faintly of wet earth and pine, thick and clinging. I turned. Nothing, just skeletal trees, their branches reaching like thin fingers into the mist. The fog swirled around their trunks, hiding shapes that weren't there yet. I moved forward slowly. The grass pressed wet beneath my soles, slippery, uneven. The hum of the forest seemed muted, distant. But the footsteps continued, tracking, patient. I paused. The silence pressed against my ears. Heavy, waiting. No one answered. No one approached. I retraced my steps. Each footstep pressed into the damp earth. And there they were, fresh prints, soft and precise, leading nowhere, vanishing into fog as if the ground had swallowed them whole. I leaned against a tree, cold bark pressing into my palms. The fog twisted and curled around me, shifting with every heartbeat, every shallow breath. I could feel something just beyond my sight, watching, waiting, patient. The footsteps were gone now. The fog held only silence. And yet, I knew I was not alone. I pressed my palms together. The dampness clung to my skin. The forest exhaled around me. And somewhere in the mist, the memory of those steps lingered, patient, deliberate, waiting for me to notice again. The cabin was still. Night pressed thick against the windows, damp and heavy. The smell of wet wood and pine lingered, sharp and cold. The door creaked, slowly, deliberately. I had locked it. I had checked it twice. Yet it moved. A whisper drifted from the threshold, soft, indistinct. I could feel it brushing my skin, curling around my ears, pressing into the room. I leaned closer. Fingers traced a crack between door and frame, cold and rough. The air smelled faintly metallic, like iron and water. And then I saw it, a figure, perfectly still, eyes fixed on me. It didn't breathe. It didn't blink. I stepped back. The floorboards groaned under my weight, wet with condensation and fear. The hum of the cabin seemed distant, muted, the shadows thickening around the corners of the room. When I looked again, it was gone, vanished into the dark, folded into the shadows like it had never been there. I pressed my palms to my cheeks, cold, clammy, tingling from the sudden chill. The door swayed faintly, hesitant, then still. The silence that followed was heavy, patient. The cabin exhaled around me. The shadows seemed to shift ever so slightly, just beyond the reach of my eyes. I did not move. I did not breathe too loud. The threshold waited, quiet, watching, and I knew, somehow, it had not left. I stumbled into a clearing. Pale light spilled across the ground, soft and unreal. The air smelled of wet grass and cold earth, thick and still. Everything froze. The wind stopped mid-breath. Leaves hung motionless on the branches. Even my own breath lingered in the air, white and suspended. A figure stepped slowly toward me, silent, deliberate. Its presence pressed against the edges of my vision. I could feel the chill crawling along my skin. The grass beneath my feet was damp, cold, heavy. The pale light shifted, brushing the trees in long, trembling shadows. I blinked, and it was gone. Only the clearing remained. Empty, still, silent. I held my breath, tasting the damp air. The forest waited around me, patient, unmoving. A faint rustle of distant leaves reminded me that time had returned, but the clearing felt untouched, frozen in some impossible moment. I stepped forward cautiously. The earth pressed soft and cold beneath my soles. The light trembled slightly, brushing my cheek like a cold hand. Shadows lingered in the corners of my vision, hesitant, almost aware. The figure did not return. I felt its absence like a weight. The clearing exhaled slowly, the wind creeping back into trees, the rustle of leaves soft and uneven, gentle and deliberate. I stayed still for a long moment, palms pressed to my thighs, skin damp and tingling. The pale light folded back into fog at the edges of the clearing, curling around the trees and softening the shadows. And though nothing remained, I could still feel it there, patient, watching, waiting just beyond the light, beyond the edges of what I could see. The cabin felt alive. Walls pressed close, dark and solid, yet they seemed to breathe. A sigh curled through the room, soft, deliberate, almost like a warning. The air smelled faintly of pine and damp wood, thick and heavy. I pressed my ear to the wall, cold against my skin, rough and uneven. Words trembled through the planks, unintelligible, urgent, curling around my senses. I could feel the pulse of the cabin, the faint hum of the boards beneath my palms. Each plank held a secret I couldn't reach, a story whispered just out of understanding. The shadows shifted with the dim light. Pale illumination caught on knots in the wood, twisting them into faces that stared and vanished. I leaned closer, breath shallow, damp air curling into my lungs. The whispering grew, rising and falling like a tide, soft and insistent, threading through the walls. I traced my fingers along the grain, rough and cold, yet warm in a strange way, as if the wood itself was breathing, holding memories pressed tight beneath its surface. The cabin exhaled around me, and I could feel it listening, patient, alive, folding its secrets into the air. I stepped back slowly. The words faded, curling into silence. Only the faint scent of pine and old earth lingered. I touched the wall one last time. The whispering stopped, leaving me alone with the quiet hum of the cabin and the sense that it remembered me. I climbed to the attic again. The stairs were cold beneath my hands, rough and damp. The air smelled faintly of dust and old wood, thick and still. Something drew me upward, soft, insistent, patient. A hum lingered beneath the floorboards, muted, almost alive. Shadows pulled in the corners. Eyes glimmered from the dark, following every motion. I could feel them pressing against the edges of my vision, soft, patient, impossible. I blinked. They blinked in unison. The motion was synchronous, deliberate. And when my eyes opened again, they were gone. The attic exhaled around me. The dust stirred in slow, curling tendrils. A faint whisper lingered, echoing softly against the rafters. Words I couldn't understand but felt deep in my chest. I stepped forward slowly. The floorboards groaned beneath me, damp with age and unseen weight. The shadows twisted and stretched, clinging to the corners like liquid. I pressed my palm against the wall, cold, rough, trembling beneath my fingers. The whispering grew softer, wrapping around the rafters, curling into the air like smoke. I dared not move too quickly. The eyes could return at any moment. The attic seemed alive, patient, filled with the weight of unseen presence. I stopped, breathing shallow, listening to the faint hum beneath my feet, the soft, echoing whisper threading through the air. The eyes did not return. Only shadows shifted, folding into the corners of the attic, and the whisper lingered just beyond hearing. I stepped back slowly, floorboards creaking under wet, careful feet. The attic exhaled, returning to stillness, and I felt it, waiting. The fog pressed against the cabin, thick and slow. Cold droplets clung to my skin, damping hair and sleeves. The scent of wet earth and pine drifted with it, heavy and clinging. I stepped outside. The ground was dry beneath my feet, yet the fog moved like liquid, pooling around roots and curling across the dirt. Shapes shifted within it, fleeting, impossible. I blinked, and they were gone, leaving only pale gray mist and the faint tang of damp wood. A soft splash echoed. Footsteps, though the ground held no moisture. I froze, breath caught in my chest, heart beating against the quiet. The fog crawled around me, pressing close, sliding over rocks, curling through grass, twisting between skeletal trees. It moved like water, patient and deliberate, and yet alive. I took a careful step forward. The cold earth pressed beneath me, solid, unyielding, but the fog responded, curling around my ankles, soft, wet, impossible to grip. I stopped again. The world held its breath. Shadows shifted at the edges of the fog, stretching and folding into themselves, just out of reach. I could hear a faint hum beneath it all, a vibration low and constant, threading through the mist, pressing against my skin, curling into my ears, unrelenting. The shapes move again. Fleeting glimpses, thin limbs, glimmering eyes, twisting impossible just beyond seeing. The forest smelled damp, earthy, and cold. I stepped back toward the cabin. The fog followed, patient, curling around roots, climbing low branches, sliding over the dry ground as if it remembered each step I took. Silence stretched between the trees. The shapes vanished. The footsteps faded. I stayed still for a long moment, palms pressing my thighs, wet and cold. The fog moved like water, curling through the forest, and I knew it waited. Dusk settled over the ridge. The fog pressed low, damp and thick, curling through the skeletal trees. The air smelled of wet earth and cold pine, heavy and still. A figure emerged, pale, featureless. Still, it stood on the ridge, watching, impossibly quiet. I felt its gaze pierce the fog. Cold, patient, as if it could see through the mist, through me, folding itself into my thoughts. The world held its breath. Shadows lengthened, stretching across the ground, wrapping around the trunks and roots like soft fingers. I blinked. It vanished. The ridge was empty now, only creeping shadows marking its absence. I stepped forward slowly. The ground pressed wet and uneven beneath my soles. Fog curling around my ankles, soft and insistent. The air shifted with a faint hum, a vibration beneath my feet, threading through the damp earth, curling into the silence of the ridge. I searched the fog. Nothing moved, nothing breathed, only the pale light fading, brushing across the trees, and the weight of being watched lingering, patient. I stayed still. The mist curled around my hair and shoulders, cold droplets clinging, pressing against my skin. The ridge seemed to stretch on forever, folding shadows and fog into impossible shapes. The figure did not return, but I could still feel it there, folded into the mist, pressing against the ridge, silent, waiting beyond sight, beyond understanding. Night pressed close around the cabin. The fog hung low, damp and thick, curling through the trees. The air smelled of cold earth and pine, heavy and still. I called into the night. My voice carried softly, trembling against the mist. It echoed back, but it wasn't mine. Low, tremulous, warning-laden. The words folded into the fog, curling around the trunks and roots. I didn't respond. I couldn't. The echo grew louder, layered, distorted. Each repetition carried a subtle weight, pressing against my ears, against my chest, against my thoughts. I stepped forward slowly. The grass was wet beneath my feet, the soil cold and yielding. The fog curled around my ankles, soft, insistent, impossible to grasp. I whispered again. The echo returned, stronger, sharpened, as if the night itself had taken my voice, twisted it into something else. I stopped. The air pressed against my skin, damp, cold, brushing along my arms. The forest was silent beyond the echo, the mist curling around the trees like slow, wet fingers. Each repetition of my voice felt alive, patient, deliberate. It lingered in the fog, pressing into the shadows, threading through the night like a pulse beneath the earth. I stayed still listening. The echo did not fade. It pressed closer, soft and tremulous, yet unmistakably mine and yet not mine. The fog curled tighter. The cold seeped deeper into my bones. The voice hung in the night, a warning folded into the darkness, and I felt it waiting, patient, beyond sight, beyond understanding. The candle flickered, casting pale light across the cabin walls. The air smelled faintly of wax and damp pine. Outside, the wind pressed softly against the window pane. I felt it first as a weight on my shoulder, cold, firm, impossible to ignore. I spun, heart tight in my chest. Nothing, Empty air pressed against my neck, a draft brushing wet, cold fingers along my skin. The hum returned, soft at first, distant, then louder, resonating to the floorboards. It vibrated under my palms, curling up my arms, threading through the room. Shadows shifted along the walls. Pale light caught on corners, stretching them, folding them in ways that made no sense. The candle trembled in the draft, wax dripping slowly onto the roughwood table. I pressed my fingers to my shoulder. Nothing but cold cloth and bone beneath. Yet the weight lingered in memory, a presence folded into the air, patient and deliberate. The hum pulsed, pressing closer, a vibration beneath the soles of my feet, curling into the floorboards, into the walls, threading through the silence like liquid. I took a step back. The candlelight flickered, revealing shadows where none should have been. The hum followed, growing louder, folding into the room, pressing against the corners of my mind. I dare not breathe too deeply. The air smelled damp, earthy, pressing close, filled with something unseen, patient, waiting. I stayed frozen. The weight was gone. The draft dissipated, but the hum lingered, soft and insistent, curling through the room, wrapping itself around the candle's pale glow. Night pressed against the forest. Fog lingered low, curling between roots and tree trunks. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, thick and cold against my skin. Leaves rustled. No wind moved them. They shifted across the forest floor like fingers, brushing softly against each other, soft, wet, deliberate. Shadows stretched long, folding over roots and rocks. The pale moonlight caught edges, bending them into impossible shapes. The silence pressed close, heavy, holding every sound in suspension. I sensed movement behind me, a shift, a presence, breath caught in my chest. Then nothing. The leaves continued, curling and twisting without wind, each small sound magnified and quiet. Snapping twigs, soft scuttling, brushing against bare feet. The forest felt alive, but with something unseen. I stepped forward slowly. The damp earth pressed beneath me, cold and yielding. The fog curled around my ankles, soft, insistent, impossible to push away. Shadows bent with it, folding into each other like slow, living shapes. Silence returned, heavy, as if the forest itself held its breath. No wind, no movement, only the distant rustle of leaves and the memory of something watching. I stopped. The cold pressed along my neck and shoulders. The mist clung to my hair, dripping softly. Shadows lingered at the edges of my vision, stretching long, impossibly thin, folding into the fog. I stayed still listening. The rustling leaves slowed. The forest seemed to settle into itself. Yet the weight of presence remained. Nothing moved behind me. Nothing breathed. Only the fog, the shadows, and the soft, insistent memory of what had passed. The cabin smelled of old wood and lingering smoke. The night pressed against the windows, thick and silent. I moved slowly, candle in hand, feeling the warmth against my fingertips. Names whispered from the corners of the room. Soft, breathless, urgent. I didn't recognize them. Each one froze me in place. A shiver crawled along my spine. The words lingered in the air, curling around the walls, twisting through the shadows in ways I couldn't follow. I stepped forward. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight. The candlelight trembled, flickering against walls that seemed to lean closer. The whispers followed, curling along the ceiling, threading into the corners. I moved through the kitchen. Empty. The hum of silence pressed against my ears. I breathed slowly, tasting the cold wood and candle smoke. Names drifted again, urgent, insistent. I followed them down the hallway. Each room empty, yet heavy with their echo. Shadows stretched across the floor, bending with the candlelight. The whispering voices pressed close, curling around my legs, brushing my skin, folding into the corners, retreating when I blinked. I stopped in the living room. The air smelled faintly of damp pine and dust. The names whispered again, soft as breath, folding into the silence, impossible to locate. I felt the weight of presence in every room. Not seen, not heard clearly, but felt deep in the bones, pressing through the walls, insistent and patient. I exhaled slowly, letting the candlelight tremble across the floorboards. The names faded into quiet. Only the hush of the cabin remained, soft and tense, holding every secret, every whisper in its walls. The cabin smelled of ash and wet wood. Outside, the night pressed against the windows, thick and quiet. I sat near the fireplace, letting the warmth brush my face. Smoke curled upward, twisting like fingers to the pale light. It thickened, moving slower than it should, folding back on itself. Then shapes formed within the haze. A figure, pale, shifting, its face blurred, indistinct, yet watched. I could feel its gaze like a chill pressing against my skin. I blew gently on the fire. The flames wavered. The smoke scattered. The figure vanished, dissolving into the curling haze. The warmth retreated. A cold lingered in the air, creeping along the floorboards, across my hands. The shadows deepened, folding into corners that smelled faintly of damp wood and old ash. I breathed slowly, tasting the smoke on my tongue. Every flicker of the fire felt alive, casting movements that were mine and yet not mine. I reached forward, hand hovering over the hearth. The smoke spiraled again, slower this time, almost teasing, almost shaping itself into something I couldn't hold. The figure had no features, but the weight of its presence pressed into my chest. The fire hissed, sparks climbing the chimney, and I shivered as the chill remained. I sat back, listening. The cabin was quiet but heavy. Every plank seemed to hold a memory. Every shadow stretched just a little too long. The fire cracked softly. The smoke drifted upward, lighter now, but still curling like fingers in the pale light. The figure had gone, or maybe it never had fully been there. I let my eyes linger on the empty space. The cold brushed against my neck. The warmth of the fire felt distant, fragile, and the silence seemed to hum with something just beyond reach. The figure in the smoke had vanished, yet the chill, the presence, the awareness of being watched, all remained. The cabin was quiet. Night pressed against the walls, thick and heavy. A pale glow from the fireplace brushed across the floorboards. I walked slowly, feeling the warmth of fire fade behind me. The air smelled faintly of ash and damp wood. Then I felt it, soft breaths, warm against the back of my neck. Slow, deliberate. The room had no draft. I froze. The shadows around me seemed to stretch, folding over themselves. The hum of silence pressed against my ears. I turned. Fog drifted along the floor, curling around my ankles, rising like smoke from some unseen fire. Nothing. No figure. No shape. Only the lingering warmth on my skin. The sensation followed as I moved, tracing the path I walked, touching, brushing, yet remaining unseen. The air thickened, heavy with tension, the faint smell of earth and old wood filling my nose. My heartbeat echoed in the quiet, a soft drum in the stillness. I paused, breath shallow, listening to the cabin hum with absence. Floorboards groaned beneath my steps. Shadows danced lightly in the pale light. I dared to breathe, and the warmth brushed again, closer, slower, deliberate. The fog shifted, curling higher, wrapping corners and edges in gentle gray. I reached toward it. The air was cool and soft, but empty beneath my fingers. Every step I took, the sensation followed. The warmth traced the back of my neck, slid across my shoulders, a whisper of presence that could not be named. I stopped listening, only the crackle of the dying fire, the quiet sigh of the cabin settling. The breaths lingered for a moment longer, then retreated into the fog, leaving a chill behind that clung to my skin. I stood alone, feeling the weight of unseen eyes, the echo of something present and yet unreachable. The cabin was still again, but the memory of that touch, that warm, deliberate breath, remained, a quiet pulse beneath the silence. The creek murmured softly. Mist curled over its edges, pale and cold. Night pressed against the trees, thick and heavy. I walked slowly, boots sinking slightly into damp earth. The smell of wet moss and leaves clung to my nose. The air was still, almost too still. Then I saw them. Eyes, dozens of pale eyes, hovering in the fog. They blinked in unison, slow and deliberate, reflecting the faint moonlight in a pale, liquid shimmer. I froze, feeling the chill creep along my spine. The mist wrapped around my ankles, whispering softly as I moved. Branches rustled, though there was no wind. I stepped closer, trying to make sense of the shapes. The eyes watched, unblinking for a moment, then blinked together like a pulse. A cold breath rose from the creek. The fog rippled around the stones, curling into vague, shifting forms. Every time I blinked, the eyes vanished, leaving only the tremor of ripples moving through the mist. I held my breath. The damp smell of earth and water filled my senses, sharp and grounding, yet unsettling. The creek gurgled quietly beneath the haze. I could feel the fog brush my skin, soft, wet, almost deliberate. The eyes returned, appearing closer now, pale and quiet, watching, then dissolving again into the rolling mist. I tried to call out, but my voice felt swallowed by the fog, vanishing before it reached any ears. A sense of isolation pressed against me. The mist seemed to thicken, pulling the shadows into itself, folding the forest around me like a cage. I took a careful step backward. Boots slid slightly in the wet soil. The eyes blinked once more, unison and silent, then rippled away completely, leaving only mist and the sound of the creek. I stayed still for a long moment, feeling the damp chill of fog on my arms and neck. The forest exhaled around me, leaves whispering softly to one another, and silence returned heavy and complete. I turned away from the creek, fog curling around my shoulders like fingers. Every step I took, the chill lingered, a quiet reminder of what had watched me and vanished without trace. The creek murmured behind me. Shadows moved and merged with the fog. The eyes were gone, but the memory of their blink stayed, pale and unblinking in the corners of my mind, as I walked back toward the cabin, alone. The cabin waited. Shadows pulled in the corners, soft and heavy. Outside, the wind pressed against the roof, thin and restless. I stepped lightly across the wooden floor. Each footfall stretched, distorted, echoing back in a way that didn't belong. The smell of old pine and cold smoke lingered, clinging to my sleeves. A creak rose from the floorboards behind me. It matched the beat of my heart, or maybe it guided it. I froze, breath shallow, listening. A whisper escaped my lips. The walls answered. Soft, trembling, almost conversational. The candle flickered, pale light spilling across the timbers. Shadows quivered with each subtle motion. The hum of the cabin settled around me, low and watchful. I spoke again. Words bounced back altered, curling around corners and twisting in the silence. The air smelled faintly of smoke and damp wood, yet the room felt alive. A floorboard groaned beneath my weight. I paused. The cabin shifted with me, subtle and deliberate. The window rattled. Fog pressed against the glass. Outside, the trees leaned closer, swaying with impossible stillness. I whispered another name, quiet, careful. It repeated, but not as I had spoken it. The sound hummed, stretched, curling against the walls. The hum and creak and rustle merged into a rhythm. Heartbeat, floorboard, shadow, one steady pulse. The room breathed with me, or I with it. I ran my fingers along the rough wood of the doorframe. Cool, textured, alive. The walls seemed to shiver under my touch, vibrating in answer. A distant knock echoed from the far corner. Soft, rhythmic, deliberate. I held my breath. The candle guttered. Shadows moved toward me, not fast, but certain. I stepped back, and the floorboards groaned again, rising to meet my retreat. Silence fell heavy, settling over the cabin like fog. The echo of my voice lingered, warm and strange. Every whisper, every creak, folded around me, intimate and alien. I sank onto the chair by the table. The wood pressed cold against my palms. The hum of the walls surrounded me, steady, almost comforting, yet uneasy. Outside, the fog shifted against the window pane. Inside, the cabin listened, and I realized I had been heard. I whispered once more, almost involuntarily. The walls hummed back, soft and deep, a quiet, patient acknowledgement that the room remembered my every sound. And in the lingering silence, the cabin waited. Not empty, not still, just listening. The clearing waited. Fog clung low to the ground, damp against my ankles. Twilight pressed through the trees, pale and hesitant. I stepped forward. My shadow stretched unnaturally across the grass, long and thin. It moved with me, but there was something else. A figure lingered at the edge of the light. It mimicked my every motion, slow, deliberate, precise. The air smelled of wet earth and smoke, and my breath came shallow. I blinked. The figure froze. When my eyes opened, it was still there, mirrored in the dark. I took another step. The shadow followed exactly, perfectly aligned. Leaves rustled beneath my boots, soft and urgent. The figure didn't blink. It didn't breathe. But I could feel it in the space beside me, close enough to brush the hair at my neck. I tried to move differently. A careful tilt of my head, a slight shift of my shoulder. It copied me instantly. The fog curled around the tree roots, pooling like liquid. Shapes moved within it, flitting impossible unseen. Yet the figure stayed focused, tethered to my shadow. I froze. The world held its breath. Only the fog swirled, curling past my legs, ghostly cold against my skin. A twig cracked behind me. I turned slowly. Nothing, just the hush of leaves and the faint hum of distant wind. I moved again. The figure resumed, gliding with me, always just at the edge of the dim light. Its outline was pale, featureless, yet watching. The clearing narrowed as the trees pressed closer. Shadows stretched over ground like reaching fingers. My heartbeat thudded in my ears, echoing across the damp earth. I stepped backward, then forward. The figure mirrored each motion without hesitation. It was patient, silent, relentless. A chill crawled up my spine, fingers of frost along my neck and shoulders. The air tasted faintly of smoke and wet leaves, thick with unease. I realized the clearing wasn't empty. It had never been empty. I blinked for a moment. The figure paused, suspended in the dim light. I held my breath. When I moved again, it resumed, sliding across the ground with me, faithful to my every motion. Silence pressed from all sides, dense and soft. The fog shifted like water around tree trunks, curling and pooling. I stepped forward, and so did it, never breaking the rhythm. I stopped. It stopped. The clearing held its pause, quiet but heavy, waiting. I turned slowly, taking the fog, the shadows, the wet air pressing cold against my skin. The figure lingered at the edge of my vision, tethered to my shadow, impossible yet certain. I whispered, barely audible. The fog swallowed the sound. It didn't answer, but it didn't need to. It followed, and as I moved again, the figure moved too, unseen except in the stretch of my own shadow. Silent, perfect, endlessly patient. Morning came, but the light was pale, thin, fragile. The fog still lay heavy, clinging to every branch, every blade of grass. It pressed against my skin, damp and cold, curling in the hollows of my sleeves. The cabin, it felt wrong, subtly shifted. Corners that had been sharp now softened. The door, though closed, seemed to lean slightly inward. The windows stared, taller than before, reflecting the fog outside like liquid mirrors. I stepped out. The familiar path twisted. Rocks and roots rearranged themselves. Every tree looked older, taller, watching. Fog pooled around the roots. It flowed like slow water, curling and retreating, hiding the ground beneath. I took a breath. It was heavy, damp, and smelled faintly of moss and wet pine. I moved forward. The road spiraled endlessly. I turned right, expecting the cabin to recede behind me. It stayed, unchanged, yet somehow alive. Shadows slipped between the trunks, long and wavering. The fog thickened with every step. I could barely see my own feet, let alone the path. It clung to me, brushing my ankles, cold and deliberate. I tried to remember where I came. Every landmark vanished. The trees had rearranged themselves. The stones had moved. The forest swallowed everything I knew. I stopped. The silence pressed in. No birds. No wind. Only the soft whisper of fog brushing against leaves. I sensed it then. Something in the mist. Patient, observing. Not hiding. Just waiting. I walked again. Each step brought no progress. The road bent, twisted, spiraled like smoke curling upward. I felt my heartbeat echo against the trees. The cabin waited behind me, unchanged, watching. A hum rose from the fog, subtle, low, almost inside my own chest. It vibrated through my bones. I pressed a hand to my ribs. It throbbed in time. I tried to run. The path looped endlessly. I turned left, right, back again. Every direction led me back to the cabin. The fog followed, curling around my feet, pressing upward. The air smelled damp, earthy, ancient. It was warm and cold at once. It smelled of rain, yet held the sting of frost. I breathed it in. It filled me, filled the space around me, leaving no gap for escape. I whispered my own name. The fog repeated it, distorted, stretched, distant. I did not answer. I didn't need to. Shadows swirled in the fog. They moved just beyond sight, shifting when I blinked. Sometimes I thought I saw shapes reaching for me, curling around the trees. But when I looked again, nothing. The cabin loomed behind me, silent, still, watching. I realized then I would never leave. The forest, the fog, the cabin, they were endless, and I had become part of their waiting. I breathed slowly. It breathed with me. I stopped moving. The fog rolled around me. It pressed softly against my skin. I understood. I was trapped, and yet not alone. The wind did not move. The leaves did not stir. Yet every corner held a presence. Soft, patient, unseen. I stepped forward. The path twisted. The forest swallowed everything I had known. The cabin waited. The fog never lifted. And I waited with it. Alone yet not. The hum continued. A steady heartbeat in the mist. The fog had become a part of me. And I a part of it. The world was quiet, cold, endless. And I finally accepted it.